All right, ladies, listen up. In fact, men, you can listen up too, because I'm sure that you care about women's health. We are about to learn exactly what is going on with the metabolism in menopause, whether you should be cycling your workouts to your period, and the common preventable thing that is making women think that there's something wrong with their hormones. And all of this juicy intel is coming at you via Dr. Alyssa Olenick. Alyssa holds a PhD in exercise physiology, specializing in exercise and human metabolism, sex differences, and menstrual cycle physiology. And she's currently doing a postdoctoral fellowship researching the areas of menopause and metabolism. So I know you're picturing a kind of stuffy academic right now, but Alyssa is also a level 2 CrossFit trainer, a certified sports nutritionist, and an ultra marathon runner. And if you aren't impressed now, you will be when you hear her drop some major truth bombs in this episode. I cannot wait for you to hear this.
It's time to get your head out of your ass and start creating a life of no regrets. Whether you want to lose weight, get rich, or manifest a hot threesome on the beach, you're gonna want to turn this up. This is Goals, Grit, and some woo-woo shit with your host, best-selling author and professional butt kicker, Una Duncan.
Alyssa, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
You are doing postdoctoral research on menopause. Do I have that right? Menopause and metabolism.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. So what do you wish every woman knew about that subject?
So the Cliff Notes is you are not broken. Your body is not broken. Your metabolism is not shattered. Your hormones are not out to get you. But some of the shifts and changes and things you're experiencing and feeling frustrated with are also equally real and valid, right? I think that there's this scary narrative out there right now of like everything's out to get you and you're doomed. And then there's this narrative of like your body's out to get you, you're doomed, versus like then this frustration of feeling like you don't have answers and solutions for the things that are happening to you. A lot of what you're experiencing is real and valid, right? So for example, like there's shifts towards central body fat that come with menopause. That is normal. If you're noticing increased abdominal central belly fat or the menobelly, I hate menopause, I hate those sayings, but that's what goes around. That's real and normal. That's coming from a decline in estrogen. That's not coming necessarily because you're directly doing anything wrong or the cortisol boogeyman's out to get you or anything like that. That shift is normal, right? In experiencing weight gain, right, wrong, or indifferent is very common. You know, that is also very common. That doesn't mean it has to be common or normal, but it is a very common experience of 5 to 10 kilos is kind of what's reported from like the SWAN studies and, you know, what we see on average through that transition. So if you're experiencing that, that is valid and normal. And if you're feeling frustrated because you feel like you didn't change anything, that's also valid and normal, right? We don't have all the answers yet in science and research of, okay, what exactly is happening behind the scenes. I think research is getting to that point now. And so if you feel unheard, like, you know, be an advocate for your health and stuff, but also the things that you need to do to improve body composition and health as you age or go through that transition are not some of these like hyper sexy, flashy, complicated things that people are promoting to you. It's still going to be the bare bones basics of what we know works. It's just what I like to say when you get to that point in life is you have like a smaller margin for error, right? So you have to maybe be a little bit more dialed in on the basics of things that we work. So what are those things, right? Because everyone's like, well, what are the basics? Because the basics are simple and they're basic, but I think one of my buddies gave me posted about this, and I love this. Instead of calling them basics, calling them the foundation, because they're foundational. Basic makes them seem simple and not flashy and not like this overarching moving thing. Like these are the big bricks, right? And so while we see, you know, with menopause metabolism, a lot of people are like, well, my menopause caused my metabolism to tank. My hormones ruined my metabolism. And here's the thing. Metabolism doesn't appear on average to decrease with age until we get into our 60s up to 70, and then it starts to decline. But there is some data that suggests that maybe with menopause, there might be some small declines in metabolism. They might be smaller than 100 calories per day, but over time, chronically, that can make a big difference for people. But there's also probably shifts to how you sleep, and your sleep quality and or duration impacts your hunger and satiety. It impacts your metabolism, and it also impacts the choices in the food that you make. With a menopause transition, you might be moving less or less active, whether that's because you're fatigued or estrogen is declining or just life. We start moving less as we age for many people. That's usually what's causing a lot of our declines in metabolism is we're just less active, right? And then also we have this decline in muscle tissue that comes from either lack of physical activity. We're less sensitive to protein and muscle protein synthesis. We want to, make sure we're lifting and eating protein to support that, but you're less sensitive to that, or you didn't really resistance train your whole life. And so muscle is one of the most important organs when it comes for metabolism and metabolic health and longevity and all that stuff, but also kind of giving you that body composition look that most people are looking for. It's usually a muscular body, so to speak. And so when I talk about the bare basics foundations, it's yes, your hormones are going to shift and change. That's going to happen for all of us, right? You're not going to 100% stop aging. I think some people are looking for the cure to menopause or 100% of stopping it. And I think that gets really lost in translation in the online space of this just is going to happen. It's going to happen to all of us. And you could potentially use HRT or not use HRT or make your choices with what you want to do to manage those symptoms based off, you and your doctor and your response to things. But you're not going to 100% reverse or stop menopause. It's going to happen. You're going to age. It's going to change. It's going to happen to all of us, right? But we can do things to make us more resilient or more robust when we're going through this, or after we've gone through it. If you haven't started with these things already, it's never too late kind of thing. And so, with that comes to improving sleep quality or duration in the best way we can. It might not be magical or overnight. It might be just sleeping for 20 more minutes or having a better pre-sleep routine or cooling your room or getting off your phone a little bit earlier. And it might be, hey, you know what? I've been pretty sedentary for the last decade or so of my life. I'm going to get back into some sort of fitness routine. Ideally, hopefully having a good bit of strength training and heavy resistance training with a focus and emphasis on building muscle tissue, but also complementing it with some cardiovascular training in some way or another. And then nutritionally, okay, well, let's drive up our protein intake, especially if we haven't been eating enough protein or prioritizing that more. Because there's some interesting data coming out too, suggesting potentially that because we have this decreased sensitivity in anabolism is kind of the fancy word of building protein and building muscle and using that for building blocks of tissue. We also might not be eating enough of it. And because of that, our body might be increasing our hunger to bring in more food to try to meet the needs of what it wants. But we're in just this hypercaloric, hyperpalatable, high calorically dense environment that you might just be bringing in a lot of carbs and fats, which aren't inherently bad on their own, but you might be bringing in more than you need because your body's trying to get in more food to support yourself. Or if you have poor sleep, your cravings are increased, or potentially, there's some suggestion too, our refinement for satiety and hunger is more refined when we become more active, when we go from sedentary to more active. And, or, it's probably so many different things are coming and impacting your in and out of your system when you're doing this, that people feel I've not changed anything, but you probably have changed enough little things that it shifted, what you're seeing. And I hate to reduce menopause to just the way the body looks, but I know for many people, that's what they're seeing and feeling frustrated with. But really, I want to encourage this population to think more about eating to support their health and their muscle, and then training to support their health and their muscle. And that doesn't mean that you can't want body recomposition or fat loss, but I think focusing on that recomposition is more of a beneficial thing when you're thinking about metabolism and your health and what your body looks like, if that's important to you, long-term, than just fat loss, and doing things to avoid fat loss or avoid fat gain or freaking out about it. Give yourself grace with the fact that your body's changing. Hormones are shifting. It is especially in perimenopause, it's like a freaking roller coaster, right? You're not going to balance your hormones in perimenopause because perimenopause itself is dysregulated hormones. That's the kind of state of what it is, right? But what we can do is do these foundational bricklaying things that help really support us, either before, during, or after, or as we continue to age across our life. And they're usually not these sexy, flashy things. The same rules apply to menopause as they did before. It's just usually you have kind of tighter margins for error. And that's where I think a lot of people realize that things that they didn't do before work for them, because they kind of have to get a little bit more specific or dialed in, or do things that they never did before because they got away with not doing them.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's such a good point because, I'll counsel people, okay, let's do the resistance training, let's do the HIIT cardio, let's, manage portions. And then people will always say, but what about menopause? What about perimenopause? And I'm like, yeah, same thing. Just like definitely do it now, and people are like, I want something different. Tell me more, something sexy about hormones or something that's going to sync with my cycle, or you know what I mean? Like people want some new flashy thing because they're having a new experience.
And what I like to say with menopause specifically is the same things that were important or are important for premenopausal individuals are important for menopause. It's just because they become more important. So everyone's like, well, lifting and HIIT is the menopause workout plan. I was like,
that's the everyone workout plan.
That's the everyone workout plan, right? Like it's just that we know those things are almost like therapeutic at that point in time when it comes to, preventing declines in skeletal muscle mass, cardiovascular, fitness and or subsequent metabolic disease that can come in response to that or shifts in our hormones. So it's not a radical, everything in female phys right now, from cycle syncing to female phys focused stuff for menopause, is just like classic strength and conditioning repackaged in a pink bow. And everyone thinks it's like some big fancy thing. And I'm like, it's great if it's getting people moving and eating more protein, but it's not like, it's just high protein and lifting repackaged for women. And they'll be like, we've been left out of studies and research. They only train us like men. I'm going to train you like a woman, high protein and weight training. And I'm like, did you hear what you just, like, that's
totally, that's the pink razor. Like it's the pink razor that costs twice as much as the blue razor.
And the thing that we really need to consider this is lived experience, individual experience in response to hormone shifts, whether that's the cycle or perimenopause or menopause, and how to auto-regulate or work with our bodies and our fatigue and all of these things as we're going through life, right? Because obviously females go through a lot more hormonal transitions between puberty, premenopausal, if you choose to have children, pregnancy, postpartum, lactating, recovering your period from that, menopause, postmenopause, like there's a lot more hormonal shifts and transitions, but there's not like this whole new, imagine if you had a whole new rule book of everything you had to do every time you went through one of those transitions. But that's a lot of what's sold to females, rather than how do we refine and adapt what we know works for the condition and situation or season that you are in. But it's still like the same components and pieces, but maybe we're dialing things up or down or sliding the percentage kind of thing, feeling like a switchboard of fitness. Like it's still a lot of the same stuff. It's just shifted and adapted to the season you're in or you as a person.
Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to follow up on, but let me take this tangent and take us to cycle syncing, because I think there is this need that women have for something that is specifically feminine or kind of recognizes that women aren't the same as men. And I feel like cycle syncing, this idea of syncing workouts to your menstrual cycle, is filling that void a little bit, as well as the void of like, do we ever get to fucking rest?
So this is my take on why cycle syncing is trendy. And I think it's people are blaming sports science for what the fitness industry did. So the fitness industry told women for years, you need to train 5, 6, 7 days a week. You need to be doing loads of cardio. You need to be doing tons of high intensity, and you need to be obsessed with fat loss. That's what they've been told for years. So hyperswing to that, then comes cycle syncing. And guess what? The women who were burnout or overextended or felt like they never got a break or had low energy availability because they were restricting their calories while doing high volumes of cardio, then do cycle syncing. And what do? They start resting and recovering. They increase their energy available, or they increased and improved their diet quality and composition when they started cycle syncing, because that kind of is trendy with it, of like nourishing your body and all that stuff, which are great things, right? But with that, we then gave, kind of this indirect permission to rest and listen to your body that you've always had. You don't need cycle syncing to tell you that it's okay to take a rest day, or that you should balance intensity more strategically across your week so you can recover, that you're not always burnt out. And you can take a rest day. You've always had permission to take rest or pull back, whether that's on your period, in your luteal phase, during ovulation, in your follicular phase. Like you always have permission to do that. And so I understand why people feel that way, right? Because of course, also perception of what's going on with your fitness during the cycle is actually probably more of a stronger driver of why people perform worse or they think they perform worse. That mixed with like PMS symptoms. And and that's like not invalid, right? Like some of the data that we have coming out is showing that, okay, like physiologically, there might not be a ton impacted by the cycle, or we just don't have the data to say if you were to train around your cycle, how you should do it. There might be small acute differences in adaptations, but right now that data is so like preliminary and novel and new or not great, or it doesn't really show that it's that much different across the month if you just train normally. And so at this point in time, it's more, okay, you might have some decreases in strength or performance in the late luteal phase or the early menstrual cycle phase, but also that coincides with potentially shifts in, your pain perception and serotonin in the brain and fatigue perception. So you might be moving less weight, or it might be harder. And that might be a mix of like your own perception and pain tolerance or RPE feeling harder during that time. Or, you might be somebody who is more sensitive to your hormonal shifts or have heightened PMS symptoms or whatever that is. But the overall like takeaway from like every expert in the field right now is it should be based off you and your cycle, and everyone's cycle month to month, let alone person to person, is different. So what cycle syncing is doing is it's taking this one size fits all 28-day prescription, assuming everyone has a perfectly cut 4-week, 28-day cycle, and everyone ovulates at the same time. Everyone's follicular and luteal phase are the same exact duration, and then giving this like overarching one size fits all prescription that is often hypothesis. And if you look at every different prescription, they're usually different. Like they're all saying a different thing. They're all saying, well, you should do HIIT during this phase and only lifting during this phase. And some of them have congruencies and themes of like only doing high intensity or strength training around like the late follicular and ovulation, and only do easy stuff in the luteal or menstrual cycle phases. And so I think two things. One, so much of this kind of shifting week to week is not what we know works when we think about progressive exercise training and adaptation. And the exercise training that you do consistently and adapt to becomes less stressful and less fatiguing and less damaging. But also it ignores this idea that like, okay, we need more than just 2 weeks a month of high or hard or heavy strength training or cardiovascular training, because especially when we think about like women meet the exercise guidelines far less than their male peers. And we do have some data, potentially there was a new study coming out that maybe women need less exercise to get the same benefits of health. Like I think that's an interesting new finding. I don't think it's like enough for us to like shift the exercise guidelines, but okay, well, maybe then we have some wiggle room there. And I have like these underlying ideas. Well, maybe it's because we have estrogen, and estrogen has all these positive benefits for us and they're protective and yada, yada, yada. But what we need instead, in my opinion, is to you can keep your training similar week to week, but what you need to learn is to adjust to your own fatigue or your own experience or your own PMS symptoms. And that might mean, okay, your 8 out of 10 effort on week 1 and week 4 might be different, but it's still your 8 out of 10 effort. Or if you're having a hard time with recovery or fatigue in the luteal phase or the menstrual cycle phase, you can pull back your volume, but you don't need to like slash your intensity. So maybe you're doing 2 sets instead of 3 sets. Or maybe you're saying, hey, my symptoms are horrific today. I don't feel good. Or you always feel poorly on day 1 and day 2. Well, maybe you're not putting your high intensity stuff on those days. Maybe you're putting your easier stuff or your rest days on those days. And like, that's not necessarily cycle syncing. That's just adapting your training to you and your life and how you feel. Like it's not like a one size fits all prescription kind of thing. And that's like my best advice, especially for general pop regular people. There's 2 sides to this coin. There's, okay, everyone doesn't need to worry about their cycle because it's not really impacting it enough for you to worry about because you have sleep and stress and life stressors that are impacting your training, which is true and valid. But also if your cycle is becoming a barrier to exercise training for you and you're someone who needs to be exercising more, well, okay, like let's work around it or work with it. You don't have to punish yourself or not push through when you feel like crap. Like you've always had permission to rest kind of thing. And if you feel good or better some weeks, feel free, push your intensity, add more weight, go a little bit harder. But then if you feel crummy other weeks, then, okay, maybe you pull back that a little bit, but that's auto-regulation and that's shifting. And that will account for a lot of the volume or fatigue things that come along with that training, or kind of giving women the skill of not always ignoring their body and pushing and giving themselves built-in breaks or rest and recovery, or balancing that intensity more appropriately across their week in training. So they actually can feel recovered and not fried all of the time.
Yeah, that is the message that we should be putting out there instead of the cycle syncing. I had a client who was somebody who would never take a break, super type A, and she was always going for it. And she got shingles, and then she reported back, I took the whole weekend off because I had shingles. And I was like, you know you can take a weekend off even without shingles, right? Like, you don't have to wait until you are sick to take time off. And I think that is
Yeah.
kind of a message a lot of women are not getting. You don't have to wait until you've
No.
got your period to take time off. You don't have to wait until you were in the ground sick in order to take time off.
No.
Yeah.
No. And that's why I think like if we get more messages out there to women of training like athletes a little bit more, you know, that has planned in deloads or seasons of lower volume and intensity or balancing your intensity across the week. And I think a biggest thing too, especially I have those clients that are very, very type A do-it-allers, they're often under eating, and that under eating itself ends up impacting your hormones and your recovery more than necessarily like working out in your luteal phase. Like that eating component and nutritional support is actually, like, when I think about premenopausal women and the most important thing they need to do to support their hormones and health and performance, far before cycle syncing, is making sure they're eating enough macronutrients and calories, like protein, carbs, and calories. I mean, fat's important too, but like carbs to match your activity level, protein to support recovery, obviously enough fat to support you as a human. You don't want to like just take fats to the floor, right? Like you still need fats to support yourself. And then just eating enough calories to actually support their activity, because low energy availability is, you know, a big issue in these populations. And that can be, you know, low energy availability is not having enough energy intake that matches like your body's physiological function and the activity that you're doing. And so it kind of downregulates its physiological processes to account for the fact that it doesn't have enough energy to function. So then you start having loss of menstrual cycle function, or like loss of ovulation, or luteal phase deficiency, or hormones get dysregulated or suppressed. And then exercise itself, when you have these things or you're putting this on the body, ends up being more stress. You have a higher cortisol response, more inflammatory response, poor recovery. Like it's actually harder and more stressful on your body than if you were fed. And so, you know, for a lot of women, they're like, well, okay, well, like I'm overweight or I need to lose weight or I overeat, so I can't possibly be struggling with this. Well, you know, if you're living off coffee and a whiff of air every single morning, and then just a small lunch or like barely enough filling lunch and breakfast, and then overeating at night, you are still in low energy availability that whole morning. If you are under eating carbohydrates to match your activity level, so, you know, carbohydrate being low can mimic or be similar, have similar symptomology to like low energy availability. And so if you're training, like these clients are working out 6 days a week, really high, hard, intense, but you're restricting carbohydrate to like a gen pop sedentary level, that can be really stressful on your body. And I think those are the rocks, along with like sleep and, you know, stress management as best as we all can, right? That we need to be thinking about first, that really do support like hormones and health and performance, and can potentially reduce even, you know, it's not for everyone, but I have a lot of people based off the advice I give who start eating a little bit more in their luteal phase, or increasing carbs around or during the training in the luteal phase, or supporting sleep a little bit more in the luteal phase, or maybe taking a little extra protein bump there. And they're like, a lot of my symptomology in my training session went away when I just kind of started allowing myself to eat a little bit more, which I know can be scary as well for women, especially at the luteal phase, you're more bloated and your digestion might not be as good. So if you feel fat and you don't want to eat more kind of thing. But some of that symptomology, or even in some studies, when women are fed in the follicular versus luteal phase, a lot of differences or metabolism differences end up going away in the fed trials or fed conditions between the cycles. So I like start there, then work up to like, let's make sure we're getting micronutrients, we're supporting our body with all the healthy vitamins, minerals it needs, following a consistent training program, actually knowing your own cycle patterns. And then from there, you can refine all those variables to adjust like nutrition or training in response to like what you personally are experiencing or needing. But if you're just doing random stuff all the time, how are you going to know what is too much or not enough, or is working or not working? So I like to work through this reverse pyramid of like macros, calories, micros, hydration, following a consistent training program, understanding your cycle and how it impacts you and how it works and your own patterns. Then, okay, we can refine from there. Usually I encourage people to start refining with nutrition first, and then potentially adjusting training as needed to help with either performance or recovery or just adherence, whatever that looks like for that person. And it's not to say you can't start tracking your cycle right away, or you have to wait 3 to 6 months to start adjusting to your symptomology. But it's saying like, don't make these broad sweeping concrete, I only do this on these day changes, because it's going to be fluid in a skill. And you might have 1 month where your cycle isn't really that bad, and then you're really stressed, or life's been really crazy, or you got sick and, oh, your cycle's like worse this month. And you need to kind of have that skill to adapt on the fly and work with your body based off how you feel. And this is a skill that's valuable for women, kind of thinking of that type A client, right? I came back from a 2-week trip. I continued my training last week pretty consistently because I needed one more week to peak. But I knew from the training and work being crazy and then peaking in my training, I was like, I got to pull back this week. I just knew that I needed to pull back this week. And I wasn't sure. I was like, am I going to push one more week in my training or am I going to pull back? And then I said, no, this week I need to pull back. I know that if I push, I get too greedy. I push too hard, kind of like stop at 80%, not 100% kind of thing, that I'm either going to get sick or be too fried out, or I'm going to get injured, or I'm just not going to recover as well. And I'm like, it's not worth me over pushing. But that's a skill you learn and gain with time of like listening to your body. And you're like, hey, and I'm like, it's not because of the phase of cycle I'm in. It's not because of anything other than I was like, my body was just not recovering as well or feeling more fatigued and run down. I was like, hey, you know what? We need a back off week. We need a week that's like lower intensity. We need to kind of bump up calories, focus on recovery, and then we'll get back to it. But that's a skill that's valuable outside of just the menstrual cycle. I think that's valuable for all people, right? Because we're humans who have, you're not just your menstrual cycle or your menopause. You also have families and pets or kids and work and jobs and sleep and stress and food and all these things coming into your system that impact your training just as much. You're not only your cycle, or you're not only your hormones.
Yes, exactly. I love that you brought up the idea of being fed, because I wanted to ask you about something you said on your site. High stress workouts are not the cause of your imbalanced hormones. You have that in quote. Under eating is. And so are you saying that what a lot of people are interpreting as maybe adrenal fatigue or something imbalanced in their hormones, they're probably just not eating enough?
There's two sides to this coin. I do think that some women genuinely overdo the exercise of like this moderate, high intensity, long duration, every single day of the week thing, or they're just not adapted to it, or they're not polarizing it enough, like balancing when it's high and when it's hard, or having enough recovery. Like they're doing too much. And that's the pushback I get all the time is people are like, well, I have these clients that are overdoing it. I'm like, yes, but they're using the tool wrong. High intensity workouts on their own, or cardiovascular workouts, or even heavy resistance training on their own, are not inherently bad things. They aren't inherently directly dysregulating hormones. They aren't directly causing menstrual cycle dysfunction, whatever it is. But when you have too much stress on the system, whether that's coming from too much exercise, not enough food, or both, that's when you start to see this dysregulation of the menstrual cycle on, for premenopausal women. So what, you lose ovulation, you have luteal phase deficiency where progesterone starts to drop because you didn't have ovulation, or your menstrual cycle gets disrupted. That's when we start to see that. So it's these things on their own aren't on their own the cause. It's either a misuse of them or not eating enough to support that, especially the carbohydrate and calorie component of that, especially for highly active females who are doing a lot of high volume or high intensity training. You need to be eating enough carbohydrates and calories to support that. And that's usually what we're seeing is like, there's not enough energy coming into the system to keep up with the volume or intensity or demands of what we're doing. And then, your body responds by suppressing, your hormones, or dysregulating them, or unbalancing them, or whatever that looks like. And, what's funny enough is there's actually been some data coming out showing that, HIIT training is the boogeyman, but people who do HIIT training in every week of the menstrual cycle actually have a reduced inflammatory response. And that inflammation itself is like a large contributor to PMS symptoms and all of that stuff. And so it's actually showing that people who, this data is early and new, but there's enough of it consistently to see this pattern of like decreased, menstrual cycle symptoms or potentially performance dysregulation that or you're like, oh, okay, like this actually could be a tool. It's not necessarily on its own a bad thing. It might be advantageous, but it's just people overuse it. And often what I see is a lot of people aren't doing high intensity exercise. They're doing this like moderate to hard continuous boot camp circuity thing, like multiple days a week, where they'd be better off reducing the days of that and shifting more days to more intentional training, or pulling out that intensity and doing a little bit high, a little bit low, and then a little bit more specific with the strength training components. It's not to say those things are bad on their own either. But again, I think it's a misuse of the tool. And then that gives all these things a bad rap. And everyone's saying HIIT's bad, group fitness is bad, Metcons and CrossFit are bad, cardio's bad, running's bad. And it's like, well, no, if you're adapted to it and you can eat enough to support it, then it's not inherently a bad thing. You just have to make sure that you're supporting your body, have that foundation of being fed, and then you're adapting to the training that you're doing. If I throw somebody in to 6 days a week of group fitness classes and they start a diet at the same time, guess what's going to happen? something's going to go haywire, right? But if you work up your training periodically over time, adapt, balance the training intensities, and eat to support it, you are going to be like, it's like, I think it's so funny in the online space. So all of these people are like, oh, these things are so bad for you, so bad for you. And I'm like, but these elite female endurance athletes or CrossFit athletes, not every one of them has a cycle. There's a lot of low energy availability and disordered eating, but they're having cycles and they're not gaining weight. They're not fat by any means. And they're doing high volumes and high intensities of training. Why is that? Okay, well, like, you have to eat to support it. And that's a lot more food than I think people realize it is.
And recover. Yeah. So now what about those people who have been over exercising, very little recovery, and under eating for like years, and they will come to you or I and say, I've broken my metabolism. Should I do a reverse diet? Can you talk about broken metabolisms and reverse dieting your way out of a broken metabolism?
Yeah. So your metabolism isn't broken. Your metabolism is adaptive. So what happens, and that's a lot of what's happening with, like, if you're overeating and over-exercising, your metabolism is broken. What is happening is you're just having like essentially your metabolism adapts and it will down-regulate because you're not giving it as much energy or enough calories to supply and support what it needs. So it starts conserving more energy. And this happens with diets, and it also happens with extreme energy restriction or all of these things. And so people are thinking, well, my metabolism is broken because the only way that they lose weight or things shift are you go lower and lower, or you have to, like, you feel like everything you're doing isn't working. And so what happens is your metabolism adapts. So it does decrease because it's adapting. But if you start eating more, guess what? It will increase. It will readapt back. It's flexible and fluid. It's not necessarily broken. Or for some of you, this is the hard pill to swallow. You're eating a lot more than you think you are. You just are going through this restrict, overeat cycle. So you're both not getting the benefits of the energy deficit that you're trying to be in. And then you're also kind of half starving yourself, and then half like you're just kind of spinning the wheel. You're eating more than you think you are. It's very haphazard. It's give or take, on or off, shifting kind of thing. And so your metabolism isn't broken. Like, I think that's so important to really stress. It isn't broken. But what happens is, this is why everyone says, I need a reverse diet and acts like reverse diet is magical. Reverse diets are not magical. They don't do anything differently physiologically for you than if you just return to maintenance. There's no difference. It's just extending the time that it takes you to get to maintenance. Now, for some people, they might be beneficial for one, if you really actually have a client or individual who's truly been like under eating, they might not be able to tolerate that many calories or food from a digestive standpoint or comfort standpoint, or they might feel uncomfortable with it. And so you might want to increase it like kind of gradually, just to titrate it over time so people can kind of get used to, like, okay, there is more food coming in the body, more digestion work, or a lot of people are scared to increase their food and calories. Or two, you might take a bump and then take another bump to try to find maintenance and see, okay, when do things kind of start moving forward again, or when do we hit it? Or if we're still maintaining weight and we keep increasing calories, maybe we just keep driving that up until we get to a point where we are at this point of, oh, okay, this is probably a ceiling of what our actual maintenance is, because we don't really know. We have a target and a range and estimates of people's maintenance, but maintenance is kind of a broad window, and so for some people it can be really wide, for some people it can be really narrow, but you might just need to find where that is. But there's no difference between just going to maintenance and slowly easing back up from a physiological perspective. It's not increasing your metabolism. It's not overshooting what your baseline ever was. It's not improving your metabolism. For most people, what it's doing is restoring your normal basic metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate back up in a way where you're kind of, again, metabolically adapting back up to that point at which your metabolism was at. So there's nothing fancy or sexy or restorative. If anything, if you've been under eating for a long period of time, and you really truly have, either, for some individuals, if you've been haphazard eating, you just need to focus on a more even kill pattern of eating before you either go into a deficit or go into a surplus or whatever it is. You probably just need to start eating more spread and normally across the day. But for the individuals who have truly been restricting and under eating for a long period of time, other than the easing back in potentially for digestion or tolerance of that, you don't want to extend that deficit any longer. All a reverse does is extend that deficit longer. If you're trying to restore your cycle or your hormones or recovery, or you are having signs of low energy availability or amenorrhea, you want to get back to a caloric intake that's, or potentially higher, overshoot it, support your body to get your cycle back or your cycle more regulated as fast as possible. And this is one of those things too, if you're one of these people who have been really overdoing it for years, if you have signs of disordered eating, which usually come hand in hand with that, please seek out from a professional. If you're not just someone who's like, oh, I didn't realize that like I really need a lot more energy for doing these things. If there's potentially an unhealthy relationship with food, you might need to work with somebody who can help you navigate that from that kind of way, because that's usually they go hand in hand. And two, one of the biggest risks with this is low bone density. And that happens with people who undereat chronically or don't resistance train. And so it actually takes like even after a year post of like eating more and regaining the cycle and gaining back weight, one, you typically have to gain more weight back to restore your cycle than you were at when you last had it. You usually have to overshoot the weight that you last had your cycle at. So just know that. And two, the bone doesn't seem to restore itself just because the cycle restores itself. It's really hard to get that back. So if you're somebody who is in these long-term chronic energy deficits, you're under eating, you're potentially very lean and very thin, like, because there are that, we always talking about like people who are potentially have weight loss or anything to do, get a DEXA scan or talk to a doctor, because those things, like if you have chronic or long-term bone loss because you've done high volumes of exercise or have been under eating for a long period of time, that's something that we really want to address. And that's usually like low energy availability is typically in like athletes and athletic populations. But I think a lot of women train at these really high, they're training 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a week. And they're not treating themselves like athletes along the way with it, versus the person who's like, maybe you're overweight or have fat to lose, or you feel like you need to lose fat, but you also feel like you've been under eating and doing everything, but you're also never gaining. You're probably doing this more haphazard eating thing. And so a reverse diet is probably just bringing you back from what you think you're eating to what you actually are eating and finding that, but in a more even kill pattern. And if you want to call it reverse dieting and that sounds good to you, go for it. But you're not magically restoring your metabolism. Or what happens for a lot of people who are kind of in that middle camp, who are under eating and then they start eating more and they start losing weight. And they're like, oh, reverse dieting fixed metabolism. What happened is more likely is that you start eating more calories. So your body started either one, ramping up its basal metabolism because it felt safe and felt like it could expend more energy, or two, without you recognizing it, you're moving more, you're twitching more, you're fidgeting more, you have more need, or you have more energy. So you're increasing your quality of your training sessions, you're walking more, you're more physically active. So you're just expending more, your body's more willing to expend energy when it has energy to give. So you can actually function and live at this higher caloric intake, but then your body's losing weight because it's still kind of in a deficit because it just started increasing energy when you increase the food intake, because shockingly food gives us energy kind of thing. So there's kind of like 3 different pathways and avenues, and you just kind of have to figure out who you are or the person you're working with and like kind of what they need in those different situations that are, my metabolism is broken. And it's either, okay, you really need to address your hormones and your menstrual cycle and your metabolism, absolutely, because it's so downregulated that it's a problem. You just need to be eating more because it's just going to allow you to move and spend more and or get to a place where your body feels safer to just give up fat, so to speak. Or you're like going through restrict, overeat so often that you just need an even kill eating pattern. And it doesn't matter how you get there. Figure that out with your coach yourself, slowly ease back up. Find a more stable place to start from, and then you can go into a deficit or maintain or build. From there.
Yeah. Alyssa, I know that you normally work with people who are interested in performance or general health and well-being. Do you train differently if your goals are more performance versus aesthetics?
Not necessarily. I think that performance goals and aesthetic goals go hand in hand. I think what happens though is you have to be considerate of, if you're building muscle and putting a muscle and eating at a maintenance or a surplus, that's a great time to push the weights. You can push other things in your training. You can handle a lot more volume across the board. But then when you have performance goals, usually for my people that are, I have clients or people who follow me who do have performance and aesthetic goals. I think that one, performance goals usually end up leading to better body composition and better aesthetics indirectly for a lot of people. But then there's the nutritional component, and we have to balance that delicately. So I usually don't encourage people, if they're wanting to do like a specific dieting phase or an energy deficit, or they do want to lose body fat, to do that like while training for a marathon. Like my friend Sarah Tierney always says, like, a marathon isn't a diet plan. So usually I'm like, hey, let's save our bigger body composition changes or bigger fat loss phases for a time period where maybe we are pulling back our volume a little bit on our training because we don't have the calories to support it. We're not removing cardio entirely. We're not like, we want to lift. You absolutely want to be lifting when you're in any sort of deficit. But then I kind of have for the people that are kind of like, they want performance goals, but they kind of want to look good while they're doing it. What I'm usually encouraging is, hey, we're eating everyone I'm telling is to eat moderate to high protein intake, but making sure you're really getting in that higher end of that protein intake to support your recovery needs and your body composition goals. We're not just giving up the weight training when we have running or racing goals. We're keeping that in a little bit all year long, or we're spending a specific period of time, whether that's a couple months or a year, depending on how much muscle tissue or strength you really need to gain, depending on like your baseline, really focusing on one goal and dialing it all in on that, and pulling back like the ratio of what you're doing, not giving it up entirely. You don't want to just give up one thing or the other at any point in time. And then, when we're doing this titration of focusing on our goals over time, it's like little shifts in energy intake. So doing like maybe 150 calorie deficits, or short acute periods of decreases, or you're specifically adding on mass or gaining or bulking in this like off season, so to speak, when you're trying to put a muscle or this year dedicated to it. But then when you are doing fat loss or weight loss, especially if you are also running or doing it at the same time, either making those deficits really, really small and then taking it slower, so you're still having energy to support yourself, keeping carbs on the higher end as much as you can and pairing them around training. And then usually for people, I usually encourage them to do deficits. You can still handle like a higher volume of training in a deficit, but keep it more like a maintenance. Don't also ramp up your training volume for whatever you're doing while you're also in this deficit. So like if you're training for a race, maybe you're in your base build phase where you're just kind of building your base, but you're keeping your mileage and intensity about the same every single week. So your body's kind of adapted to it. And that might be a good time to maybe, okay, we're going to try to recomp during this phase in time. And it's just about timing it to when your training and performance isn't at like, don't peak for your race that you're trying to do. Because for everyone also, like the stimulus of like what you're trying to do, whether it's a race or a lifting competition or an event, is going to be the highest like the 4 to 8 weeks leading into that event. So that's probably not the time to be dieting or in an energy deficit. If anything, you need to be eating more to support that, right? And it doesn't matter, like it doesn't have to be like a marathon or something crazy, because even for people who are new to stuff, that first powerlifting meet or first time you're lifting or first 5K or 10K, like those are still very hard on your body because they're new to your body. You're not adapted to them, right? If I was just doing a 10K, I could be in an energy deficit because that wouldn't be that much of a stressor for me. Versus somebody else that might be a big stressor for us. You kind of have to consider where you're at. So like a good example is last year I did like a really kind of acute deficit thing. I kind of intentionally bulked a little bit over winter, ate a little bit more. And what I did is during like an 8-week, 9-week period where I was kind of running exactly the same amount of miles every single week and my lifting was really consistent, I just did the tiniest energy deficit. And it was like the slowest thing. And I only lost like maybe 3 to 4 pounds, but I also wanted to maintain muscle and or gain it during that time while sustaining my running. And I didn't have a ton of weight to lose, but for a lot of people, that's the body recomp is a very slow, tiny bits at a time. So focus more on that gradually, or just take a period of time where you're not spinning all your wheels, pull back that volume, pull back that intensity, introduce your deficit, get in and get out of that deficit. Like if that's what you're going to do when you're doing it, and then bring your food back up to a maintenance level and then resume kind of higher volumes of training of what you can do. And that's like where a coach can come in and you can monitor recovery and sleep and biofeedback, as everyone likes to say it. Because within athletics and sport, and like a lot of athletes have body composition goals, and that's not necessarily inherently a bad thing. But also I think there's a lot of leaner athletic women who are still trying to always spin their wheels on being leaner or thinner. And sometimes you have to have a conversation of yourself of like, do you really need to be leaner to perform better? Or do you really need to be leaner for health? Like I always joke that I stay a little bit fatter because I recover better and perform better, being able to eat more, even at this higher percent of body fat. And like, I'm not a high percent of body fat, but I don't need to be 15% body fat. I don't. I feel I can eat enough and I feel better being at that like 18 to 22% range, which is still very lean for a female, but I don't feel the need to like really lower that down just for the sake of aesthetics, because I know that I can perform well and feel better. And fitness isn't a look, it's a skill, is what I like to tell people. It's like you have to give the training stimulus to move yourself forward. And sometimes body composition plays a role in whether or not you're performing well. But if you're, don't blame your body when your fitness is the limiter. Usually I say address the fitness first. And then if there's something that feels like you need to move the needle forward, then talk about that. But usually that's when like, you got to look at the risk reward of like, am I already lean or do I have weight to lose? Like, is this the time for this? Is this the season? Where do I need to pull back and when do I need to dial up kind of thing? And it's just a dance of those two stressors on the system at the same time.
You said fitness isn't a look, and I love that. But a lot of us think of a certain look. If you said, think of someone who's really fit, the image that goes into people's minds isn't actually someone who's really fit. Do you find in your work, because you are an obvious expert at this, and you choose not to be super lean, like super, super lean, do you ever find that you feel like you don't have as much credibility or that people don't listen as much? Or do you ever feel any social pressure to get leaner in order to have a bigger voice?
So I definitely think that if I wanted to appeal more to like the lay aesthetic fitness person, especially with the hybrid training space, that if I was a little bit leaner, yeah, people might take me a little bit more seriously. But I also think that because I choose to not focus on my body as my business card or centralize my body and my content, it's also actually gotten me a lot more clientele and followers and support because it's not about my body. Because here's the thing, I've been 15% body fat on my Instagram and I've been 23% body fat on my Instagram. I've been 153 pounds and I've been 133 pounds. And I've been in every body composition in between over the last 6 or 7 years that I've been in the online space. And I never really talk about it. I never make a big deal about it. I never highlight it. And what I notice is that people don't really notice. But also, at the end of the day, I could exploit the fact that I'm very muscular and very fit a lot more than I do. But I also recognize that like my own performance isn't also a reflection of my own knowledge. I have training age and I have past athletic experience, and experience does matter too. So I think early on, I used to think, if I don't have abs, I'm not credible, but that's just silly, right? I'm like, okay, well, I'm very strong and I run very far and I'm very fit. My fitness is a reflection of my fitness, right? My knowledge is a reflection of my knowledge. And I know a lot of younger coaches feel like they have to be a certain look, certain thing, but the right client's going to find you because of who you are and where you're at. And I also like when people insinuate that, not to say you didn't, I just think it's silly because it's like sometimes people will thank me for being like mid-sized or not being as lean. And I think it's like more of a sad reflection of what people view as lean because I'm like, or being overweight because I'm like, I've always been, not always, but growing up, especially, I was more insecure because I always carry my weight in my midsection. So even when I'm leaner, my stomach isn't lean. And that's just how I remember being an athlete in high school and feeling insecure because I had like a little bit of belly fat compared to all the other girls. And that's just how I've always been built. And I've luckily never really struggled with weight and like never been overweight. It's just like how I'm built. And so there was a period and phase where I felt like, okay, that made me less credible or people wouldn't trust me because of that, or that's just how I gain weight. But like, I don't know. I just decided personally to not let it define me. It doesn't mean that I'm not aware of it. But two, I also makes me sad though when people see me when I'm at a higher body fat percentage or gained a little bit of weight whenever I fluctuate, because we're all do, but I'm still like in a low 20s. I'm still very fit. I'm still very strong. And I'm like, okay, but that makes me sad because it's like either your perception of leanness and health is so skewed that you think I'm somehow kind of not overweight, but just like reflective of a different, I don't know, like, I don't know how to say that without it seeming self-deprecating. Cause it's just like, I'm like 22, 23% body fat when I'm usually like at my heaviest. And I'm like, that's still very lean. So I think there's a skewed perception of what leanness and fitness and athleticism can look like. And that still is having some fat on your body compared to what people think. So that's more so where my thinking goes, is like, it almost makes me feel worried about people's perception of like, okay, well, what do you think a fit body has to look like to be fit? Because a lot of women carry more weight and they carry more fat, or you might be like me and you just carry more weight in your midsection, right? I'm 5'1", my ribs touch my hips. And like, I'm like, there's only so much place for things to go. Right. And so, yeah, I used to feel a lot of insecurity around that when I was younger. And then as I got older, I don't know. I've never centralized my body in my business, and that's intentional because then it allows for the client or the person to not compare themselves and contrast themselves to me. It's like even with my business branding language we're working on now, like my client is the hero of their own story. My body isn't the hero of people's story. My body tells you nothing about what you can do or what you can become. And I always try to drive that message home. So I think like decentralizing me and my body and what I can do from what people can do or the information I can give them has been really key in doing that, because you never know what's going to happen. And I went through a period of time in my PhD where I put on weight. My health was a wreck. Stress was crazy. I was breaking out. My hair was falling out. Like I was rough. Like I was like age 10 years and not in the best place. And I just didn't define myself by it. I just showed up and did the best I can and acknowledged that I was pulling back certain parts of my training or I couldn't keep up with things and I was struggling. But I didn't make a big deal about the fact that I was the heaviest I'd ever been in my entire life, right? I just said, okay, well, like if I'm doing this, I'm just going to ride the train and get really strong right now and put on a bunch of muscle. And I'm going to take advantage of that instead of just making it this focal point of like, oh, I gained weight and lost weight. And I didn't talk about when I lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just existed, right? And I think more people would be beneficial in their health and fitness if they recognize your body will shift and change and evolve with time and training goals and all of these things. But if you don't, you'll have moments where you're aware of it or you're insecure of it or like you don't feel great in it. But if you don't make it your entire identity, even if you're not running a brand or a business, like it makes it a lot easier to also take like a bird's eye view, non-body centric approach to adjusting that. So like when I did my DEXA and I was like, okay, you know what? Like you're at a place where like it wouldn't be harmful for you to lose fat or it's not necessary for you to like, you're not at a place where like losing fat would be necessarily harmful, but it's also not necessarily like bad if you didn't kind of thing. But I kind of objectively look at that and say, okay, that's my body composition and I have this much fat in my body and I probably don't need that much fat in my body, but also if I did, it would be okay too. And I could just very objectively approach a deficit or a gain phase or whatever it is and not be catastrophic about it, right? Like pushing up my weight intentionally and gaining weight intentionally is something that I've done a lot to put on muscle and strength in the past. And if you aren't married to this idea of your body or you can shift and change with time, it helps kind of remove that pressure of it. Or if life happens, then you also aren't identified as this thing. I think that's really, really, really helpful and hard. It's hard for everyone to do, right? And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but I think that's something that I've really stressed in my branding and my message and my clientele is like, the fitness isn't a look, it's a skill thing allows us to focus on what we can do in our performance and how we show up independent of what our body looks like. And so, people are like, well, you think body composition doesn't play a role at all? Well, no, not necessarily, but you're far better off going to the gym and focusing on improving performance than making every gym session about your body. And the same thing goes with even if you have body composition changes. I think it's really actually helpful for people to not have this super tied relationship to the scale or their body every single day, because it's not this perfect linear, we're always going to be exactly the same kind of thing. And having this emotional whiplash to the response of your body, it just makes it so you're always mad at yourself or shaming yourself or belittling yourself. And you're not on the same team then with your body. And I think sometimes that neutral bird's eye view, objective view of your body kind of helps you make choices, even when it comes to the performance versus the aesthetics versus what's worth it versus what you want, in a more logical manner than an emotional kind of responsive or like body shame driven reason or whatever it is.
I love this. I think this is such good advice to not centralize how your body looks to your fitness journey. I think this is so smart. And I would love, we've been talking a lot about physical strategies for women to excel. And I would love to hear about any other mindset things that you think are really important when you're working with your clients. What have you noticed about the role of mindset in achieving their goals?
I think that for me, I love using fitness as a tool in the female population because it allows them to do something hard and challenging and bigger than themselves that's scary. And in one, you have to show up for those goals and train like hell. And it's you kind of learn that you can do hard things or to trust yourself only when you do them. So it's putting yourself in those uncomfortable positions. I find that so many, not everyone, but a large subset of the females I work with or in general, they lack so much trust and confidence in their bodies and their body's abilities and what they can do. And they feel like they need to be 120% ready before they do the thing. But you don't. You just need to do the work and show up and trust that you can do the thing. And you sometimes just have to do the thing scared because that's the only way that you learn that you can do it. And I think through heavy strength training or running far, running fast, or running that goal, whatever that is relative to you, right? Strength and distance and pace and effort are all relative to you. I think it's life-changing because sometimes people finish these things or do these things and it shifts their belief about who they are. And that shifts the story of what they say and who they are in their head to themselves. And I think fitness can be really, really powerful with that because it's giving people this completely different look into who they are or what they can do or what they're capable of. And I think this is more than just women. We see this all the time with people. People do get super into fitness and then all suddenly they're inspirational speakers and they want to help the world and tell everyone. But like there's something to that, right? Doing these hard things and challenging yourself, I think it makes you mentally grittier or tougher, but also sometimes it's just showing you who you always actually were. You don't necessarily become this revolutionary new thing. It's just showing you, oh, this is the person that I am. And then some other mindset stuff too. I think, you have a different whole bunch of clientele that comes. It's like the do-it-allers and the extremists and the cling to everything with all their might, like the can't take a day offers, like give them the mindset shift of like, okay, you don't need to be chasing all of the volume and all of the training and all of the things all of the time. Like showing them to trust kind of the antagonist, trust that they can do less and pull back and not be so death gripped on their training and that their body and fitness doesn't just shatter. If anything, sometimes it's actually better because of that, right? And then you have the mindset of helping clients who are very black and white on and off of like, okay, instead of saying I only train if I can only train 100% this week, getting used to the uncomfortable feeling of like, I'm only going to get in 1 day this week, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm only going to get in 2 days this week, but I could do it anyway. Or you know what? I've been consistently trying to get 4 days every single week and I fail. So I do nothing. But what can I realistically do in the worst week ever? 2? Okay, let's start with that. And so for those people, like getting into the uncomfortability of like doing it imperfect versus doing it perfect or not at all, and getting into that idea of like, being flexible and it being like always being imperfect or always missing the mark or only getting to 80% or adjusting your expectations of what your 100% is, I think is one of the most important mindset shifts as well. Like these are the biggest things that I see with clients that I think are really transformative for them. And then the last one would be taking a step back so you can take a step forward. Sometimes people's brains and their spirit and their goals are 2 steps ahead of their fitness. And sometimes you need to take a step back or humble yourself or pull back or regress so you can move forward. So sometimes this happens a lot with people who used to be fitter athletes and come back to training after a long time off, or they had an injury, or, their egos want them to be able to do more, but they need to do less to be able to do more. I think all of these mindset shifts for so many clients are just, it's really what it is. It's just challenging what you think has to be true for you to make progress or move forward, or what has to be true within your fitness and training, or just teaching them self-belief and trust in their bodies, whether that's by doing something that's hard and scary or doing less, which is hard and scary in its own regard for those individuals. So like those are the mindset things I think I see. I work largely with females, and it's not to say males don't struggle with this too, that's like the subsets of buckets that I really see, like this lack of belief and trust in your body, overdoing it, or the flexibility that you need to have to be a human who also values exercise and also knows it's not going to ever be perfect and you're going to do it anyway.
Oh, so good. Oh my gosh. Alyssa, I know that everyone's going to want to know more about you, learn from you. Tell us where people can keep in touch with you.
Yeah, so I hang out the most on Instagram, Dockless Fitness, and you kind of find everything you need to from there. Dockless Fitness on YouTube, docklessfitness.com. My programs are the LIST method, and then my podcast is the Messy Middle podcast. But if you head to Instagram, you'll find everything there.
Perfect. I will definitely link that. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and just like you're such an amazing fountain of knowledge. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know I feel like I can rant and talk and chat all day.
I love it. I love it when you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Isn't Alyssa awesome? Dude, I heard her on another podcast and I immediately wanted to get her on the show. So here are some of my big takeaways. 1, you aren't broken. I love how many times Alyssa repeated that. And I love that she said that while also validating that women's bodies fluctuate in so many ways for so many reasons. And that can be hard and really frustrating. Also, she said, we have permission to rest. She brought this up when we were talking about cycle syncing, as well as when she talked about proper periodizing of training programs for performance, and when she talked about weight loss. Also, permission to eat. So many women are underfeeding themselves, which can lead to low energy availability, which can lead to poor fitness results, cycle interruption, and a lot of other factors that some people are attributing to dysregulated hormones. And oh my gosh, I loved our conversation about fitness is not a look, it's a skill, and her conscious choice to decentralize her body in her fitness content. So good. But tell me what you got out of it. I would love to hear what you thought. And if you learned anything in this interview, please share this episode on to anyone else who needs to know this stuff. All right, I'll see you next week. Hey dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.